what is a public finance dedicated to climate change or climate public finance? It has been like said for many, many years that all the financial flows that are supporting for one hand, the reduction of emissions, and for the other hand, the reduction of vulnerability is considered climate finance. And when we refer to the public finance, we refer to those resources that come from governments that are normally allocated through public expenditure, but also that are allocated through multilateral development banks and others that receive these resources from developed countries. It is important to say there is not like a universal definition about what is it, but we know that are those resources that are going to help us to tackle climate change, reducing emissions, as well as reducing vulnerability, and that come from these sources. So who has access to public finance dedicated to climate change? Well, in theory, all developing countries through their governments should be able to access to climate finance from public sources. However, in practice, not all developing countries have the same opportunity to access to these resources. Sometimes it's related to the time consuming that implies this access, but also sometimes it's related to the institutional arrangements and the capacities that some governments and some countries have to actually access to these resources. So even though in theory all developing countries should be able to access, the allocation of this finance support is not equal. Some regions are receiving more resources than others, and within these regions, some countries are receiving more resources than others. Related to the who are the key entities that help to access these resources, it is important to say that historically the climate finance support has been going through governments because governments are part of the international commitments or international agreements that are, let's say, the ones that are interacting to access to these resources. So normally the way to access to these resources is through governments. Actually, in certain cases, certain entities within governments, for instance, the finance ministries or the environmental ministries, are the dedicated or the designed focal points for certain institutions. For instance, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, the Adaptation Fund, they have their own designated focal points to access to these resources. Of course, this is important to facilitate the engagement in the context of these mechanisms, but sometimes this can be also a bottleneck. Why? Because if you don't have like a strong, let's say, group of technical people allowing or ensuring that this access happens, sometimes it's very limited the space that governments have to let's say to access to these mechanisms, because sometimes takes a lot of time. And even sometimes takes even two years to access to these type of mechanisms. And also there is another concern related to the necessity to have better access systems to allow the participation, for instance, from local governments or local entities that are not always, let's say, connected or have a relationship with national governments, who are the ones that most of the time have this relationship with these financial mechanisms at the international level. This analysis about the enabling conditions, I think enabling conditions, we have to analyze them in two levels. Enabling conditions can be analyzed from the developing country or the recipient country perspective. This is how countries can prepare themselves better to access and to manage resources. And of course, one of the critical elements is how to empower and how to strengthen the institutional arrangements in the countries to allow them to understand better the needs or the requirements to access to these financial mechanisms. And of course, this is a big need because it's a big gap in developing countries. Not all the countries have dedicated offices to, for instance, understand and follow the rules of these financial institutions that require a lot of time and effort to access. So definitely it is important to continue empowering and strengthening the capacities at the national level. But also it is important to say that sometimes there will be developing countries that won't have all the architecture that is needed to access. In that sense, I consider that the enabling conditions are also related to the donor or the country that is providing the resources. I think it is important that these countries or these financial mechanisms understand that the needs and then in the capacities will be different. And it is important in that sense to internalize that not all the countries will respond in the same way. And these financial mechanisms have to adapt to those different capacities as well. Otherwise, we ended up like, yeah, providing resources to certain countries that have more capacities, but actually are not the most vulnerable ones. And the most vulnerable ones are the ones that don't have like super strong architectures, and they are the ones that needed the money faster and urgently. And so the financial mechanisms should also adapt to those realities to be more effective in the way that they allocate the resources. The type of projects that international climate funds can, let's say, promote or where they can invest, I think this type varies a lot, and we can differentiate them, for instance, in the type of thematic area, let's say mitigation, adaptation. There are huge differences. But for instance, when we refer to certain projects in the mitigation side that is related to the reduction of emissions, we can talk about, like, for instance, the implementation of a technology or even like a change in the policies. No, for instance, for adaptation, these realities can be different. In adaptation, sometimes it's not only a change in the technology, but it's a process, no? Like, for instance, building capacities in certain populations that are under risk and how they should relocate from one side to another side. So the type of projects varies a lot. And I think it's important also to consider that projects can be also depend on the context. Some projects will be more small scale, others are medium scale, or others are big scale. And also certain projects can be more like at the national level, others can be more local, others can be even regional. For instance, we observe that the Green Climate Fund tends to invest in certain processes or projects that are even regional because certain countries or certain regions share like problems related to, for instance, adaptation or the loss on biodiversity. So I think it is difficult to say that one project is like, or let's say, fits to all the type of context. And this is why sometimes international climate finance can be so difficult, because everything can be part of this type of projects, and sometimes it's difficult to say when is a climate change project and when it's not, because it's also related to a lot of development areas. But generally speaking, we observe like there are several projects at the sectorial level: energy, transport, waste. And when we talk about adaptation, we see also other sectors such as water, forest. So and this is precisely why climate change is so important, because it's so cross-cutting, and therefore it is important that the allocation of this climate finance support goes equally, no, in the different sectors. And obviously, this will depend on the needs of certain countries. No, like certain countries will have more needs on the forest area, others will need more support on the energy transition. But everything is part, let's say, of the climate finance support. The breakdown of the type of funding varies a lot and depends a lot on the region. But just to give an example, what has been observed in Latin America is like, well, 90% of the projects that have been, let's say, funded by climate finance resources, public resources, are dedicated to mitigation, and only 10% for adaptation. And 70% out of these resources that are dedicated to mitigation are or come in a form of loans. This means that is money that the countries that are receiving this money will have to pay back. And there is obviously a huge debate about the importance to have climate finance that really dedicates or is in form of grants, because according to the convention, it is important to have the support from developing countries that is new and additional, because a lot of developing countries do not have the fiscal space to invest in all of these mechanisms, and that's why there is a huge call to increase the financial support in form of grants. However, we see more and more financial support that comes in form of loans. And this has also created other type of problems at the regional level. For instance, we see that more countries that are already in debt have like huge levels of debt, external debt. Now, in the context of climate change, on the climate finance, this indebtedness is increasing. And now, for instance, a lot of countries are not like having the possibilities to invest resources to tackle climate change. So I think this is one of the areas that has to be like has to improve. No, climate finance. Of course, it is important to have the participation of different instruments, but the whole idea of climate finance is precisely support developing countries in facing the problems that related to climate change, and therefore having more loans on this regard is just increasing the burden in developing countries, when it shouldn't be like that, because the convention said that it shouldn't be like that. And this is one of the huge changes that we will need to see in the coming months and years. There is an important difference between what is the mobilization and what is the provision of climate finance. The provision has been related to that commitment that developed countries have with developing countries to provide financial support to implement mitigation and adaptation actions. In the past, some goals that have been set in terms of the provision is precisely the 100 billion that was committed in 2009. And the idea is to provide 100 billions per year by 2020, with the idea precisely to allow countries to reduce their emissions and reduce their vulnerability. But of course, there is a huge necessity to mobilize more resources, and this is actually related to the Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, that actually talks about the necessity to make all financial consistent with a low greenhouse gases and climate resilient development. And in this context, of course, we are not only talking about public resources, but also private resources. And the mobilization is related to how we are going to scale up the money that has been provided to actually mobilize more resources to increase these flows and to cover other needs that probably are not related to the governments only, but are also related to the necessity to transform, for instance, industries, the economy, the sectors in the ground. And there is a huge debate and a huge difference, because one thing is related to the commitments, and the other thing is how to scale up climate finance to really achieve a transformation that is going to be deep, and at the end of the day is going to lead us towards the compliance of this 2.1c goal that is the Paris Agreement is telling us to follow. In terms of what is important or what is needed at the national level, there is no doubt that the design of the national strategies that are, for instance, the national determined contributions and other climate policies that have been designed nationally are a very important point to define what is needed. No, and I think in this context, it is important to say that not all NDCs are reflecting all these needs. Sometimes NDCs are just showing part of what is needed at the national level, and that's why it is important on one side to improve and to really revise these NDCs to make more, like, not only include all these different actions that are needed, but at the same time, it is important to have like an implementation plan. How much are these NDCs? How these NDCs will be financed? Because we know that not all NDCs will cover by national resources through the public expenditure, but will require precisely these international common finance flows, mainly public resources, but also it's going to be able to promote other mechanisms such as private resources. But there is a huge gap still in terms of the understanding about how much are these NDCs. And in the context of the Standing Committee on Finance, the needs report was a first attempt to identify how much are actually how much is actually needed, no, to implement the NDCs. And we know that not all developing countries have been able to determine the cost, but this is also because it's not easy, requires time, and particularly requires the participation of several actors, because this is not only about how much money the national government needs, but also how much money the local communities, the cities, the vulnerable groups need. And I think the big opportunity that we have is precisely to use international finance flows, particularly from the public sector, to support developing countries in determining those costs, to then not only design a new collective and quantified goal based on needs, because the countries need to take into consideration needs, but also because having this information, developing countries will be able to connect better needs with flows. And I think that's a massive gap that we see still. We see more and more reports saying that the climate finance flows are increasing and are flowing more and more. However, we don't know if these financial flows are actually reducing emissions or to what extent are actually reducing vulnerability. Because we are not connecting finance flows with needs. And this is one of the most important elements if we want to improve effectiveness. And this is precisely some of the elements that we need to consider, like how to connect better these NDCs, but understanding how much are they and how can we implement and connect with other resources, including public and private resources, national and international as well.